Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to Sigest. I'm your host, Hilary Ireland. Gene editing, genetic modification, cell-cultured foods, robotic technologies, controlled environment agriculture. These terms stimulate a range of responses from different people, from interest to acceptance to apprehension or plain indifference. When developing new food systems for a changing world, it's critical to consider consumer attitudes towards new food technologies. On today's episode, we hear from a panel of researchers studying consumer attitudes and perceptions towards new food technologies, both here and in key export markets. Welcome to the podcast, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to be here.
Kia ora. Nice to be here.
So let's introduce the panel. Denise, can you please tell the listeners your name, your role in this research, and a little brief synopsis of your science background?
Sure. My name's Denise Conroy. I'm the team leader for the Stakeholder and Consumer Research team here at PFR. And my background is as a psychologist. So I've worked with consumer research for a long time, maybe over 30 years.
Wow, great. How about you, Amy?
Yeah, kia ora. So I'm a visiting researcher here at Plant and Food Research. I work with Ivy and Denise on various projects. My main background is in consumer insights within industry, but recently I've gone back to academia. So I work a lot in consumer behavior on more the quantitative side of things, and I also do a lot of work in more the social science realm, looking at more the cultural side and the qualitative side of things.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. Here's Ivy, and I'm part of the stakeholder and consumer team at Plant and Food Research. And I joined the team since 2019 after obtaining a marketing PhD from Auckland University. Yeah, so I've been working with Denise on the program, which we are going to talk about since its beginning. And yeah, that's a very exciting journey, and really looking forward to talk more about that.
Excellent. Thank you. So Denise, as leader of the Future Urban Consumer Program, can you provide a high-level overview of the program?
Yes, so the program's aim was to try to determine what consumers in the future might want from food and food systems. And as part of that, we needed to look at what technologies may be needed to support the way things were going to grow in the future. So it's very important for any business to have social and cultural license. And to actually get that, you need to be able to talk to consumers about what benefits they see, what risks they see, so that you can position things correctly.
And how does this work fit into the broader context of research occurring here at Plant and Food Research?
So as social scientists, which is what my team actually are, it's our role to understand consumers, but also the societies that they're actually in. So understanding New Zealand, for example, doesn't mean that you've then got insights for our export markets. You actually need to understand consumers in each market, and that's what we do.
Wonderful. So Amy, why is it important to understand consumer attitudes and perceptions?
Yeah, so I'm just going to build on a couple of things Denise has already mentioned. There's three key things, but I think two of the most important elements is that in this program specifically, future thinking, but we also need to realize that we're dealing with new technologies. So one of the most important things when you think about consumers and even ourselves in society is that when a product or a technology is introduced, quite often we assume that people will adopt them and use them in their daily lives. And that's not quite the case. People are quite often apprehensive. They're very fearful. So understanding how people are feeling, their emotions, also kind of their cognitive thoughts and barriers around the technologies can really give us an idea of whether they will accept them, how they'll engage with them, and in the long term, how they'll essentially adopt them. So it's kind of one of the most important things to understand and not just assume that a consumer will pick up food product and automatically start consuming it. Mm-hmm. Another thing is that we look back at our kind of year so far in 2023, and there's been so many environmental shifts. And so we can think about things like climate change. We had, disruptions to the production and cycle of the food supply during COVID, and that's continuing on a bit today. And thinking about how do consumers actually shift their thoughts and feelings around whether they're going to accept some of these technologies, and how do the kind of societal shifts play into that. So there's another really important reason to actually look at how people are feeling right now to almost start to determine how that can potentially evolve in the future. And the third thing I would say, and Denise also touched on this, is really important to understand the nuances in different markets. So if we, let's say we develop a technology here in New Zealand and we release food products out of that technology, it may be accepted here, but you have to look also at export markets to understand, will there be something, similar themes, similar attitudes, similar perceptions there? Or do you have to take a bit of a different vantage point? Yeah. So those are kind of I'd say 3 key reasons on why it's so important.
Yeah, and adding to what Amy has said, it's also not only important to understand consumers, but also using what methods to understand them and in what context you are gaining that kind of understandings.
Absolutely. Some really important considerations there that have very wide consequences. So it'll be great to learn more about the study. Why don't we do that now? Do a little bit of a deep dive into the study details. Firstly, I'm sure a discussion of methodologies could take a whole episode of its own. Perhaps, Ivy, could you give the listeners a small taste of the main methods used in this research?
Yeah, definitely. That definitely deserves a whole session called research method, and I'm sure Denise is an expert of teaching that. But simply put here, most of our research done for this program specifically is exploratory in nature, because we are talking about things like future technologies and what people are making sense of these technologies, and we know little about it, and we don't know what we don't know. That's why we need to firstly explore, and with that primary aim to understand what consumers thinking about that, and their views, their emotions, their values associated with this technology, and also like the way how they talk about the technology, what kind of terms they use to describe, and how they build up the linkage between the technology and their personal life, etc. So that's very important for us at the starting point of our program, with the aim to understand first. And then the philosophy behind that is that we acknowledge that people mostly live with their perceptions and hold to the perceptions and making decisions based on that, rather than based on what we so-call as the scientific truth. So we have to acknowledge that. And we also acknowledge that people from different social and cultural backgrounds usually will have different perceptions as well, and we need to factor that in our research as well. So always we will start with qualitative methods like in-depth interviews and focus groups to capture the richness of people's lived experiences, and also capture that in a way that people talk about that from their own understandings, using their own terms, rather than force them into any pre-existing and devised by researchers kind of structures. So, and then after analyzing those kind of qualitative data, we will generate insights which we will use to inform our subsequent studies, which are more quantitative approach, like larger scale surveys, etc. And then some specifically looking into the causal relationships as well. And by combining both the qualitative and quantitative approach, we are trying to, give more like a holistic, the full picture of what we are studying. And in the case of future urban consumers, we started with doing quite a lot of focus groups, which generate really a whole lot of rich data for developing our surveys and other type of quantitative studies. So that's really helpful.
Well, and what were the sort of broad demographics of the surveyed populations?
One of the reasons why we use focus group quite a lot for this program is that we want to capture a wide range of different perspectives, and focus groups are really good at doing that because you are in a group discussion setting, and then people may inspire each other in the discussion as well. So for focus groups, we kind of trying to capture a broad range of participants. So we will try to have like a good mixture of different gender, different age, and household sizes, income level, etc. So ensure we hear different voices from different perspectives.
Yeah, so Ivy's definitely correct. When we either run surveys or experiments, typically you want a representative sample of the total population, other than, of course, people under the age of 18. So they wouldn't be included. If we're running it in different countries, we'll look at what percentage of age groups make up different cohorts. So if, for example, you have an inverted pyramid and you have a majority of consumers maybe a bit older, you would just look to balance that that percentage also across gender as well. So you're typically looking for, the voice of the everyday person and ensure that everyone is included. Yeah.
And in terms of like rural and urban living, was that covered as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it was quite important in the focus groups Ivy was mentioning to get representation across different geographic areas in terms of their proximity to horticulture areas. Mm-hmm. So we did delineate our cohorts between those who lived in urban centers and those who lived in rural areas in our focus groups. And that was across Australia, New Zealand, and then we also did age as well. Mm-hmm. So we ensured a kind of a representation of different ages, but ensured that the differences between age groups were captured so that when we were running an analysis, we would understand if there are nuances in between the different cohorts.
Great. And Denise, which new food technologies were surveyed and how were they presented to the consumers?
Our program is part of a wider direction whose aim is really to focus on closed environment agriculture, or CEA, sometimes called vertical farming. Mm-hmm. So growing things indoors but on a massive scale. So that was where we started, and then we had to consider which technologies may be needed to support growing indoors. So the things that we were looking at were robotics, because if you're indoors, you want as few people in there as possible so that you don't need to spray, for example. We were also looking at genetic editing, and that's because at the moment, where there are vertical farms, they're really restricted to growing leafy greens like lettuces and some berries. But if you're going to try and get woody perennials indoors, then yes, you can do that by breeding, but potentially it would be faster if you were able to do some GE. We also looked at cellular agriculture and precision fermentation as well. Now, these are all things that are potentially out there, but most everyday participants wouldn't have heard of. So we presented really simple concepts on little cards for people and then put them on screen in focus groups. And we had to be really careful to give enough information, but not so much that we biased anyone either pro or against. Mm-hmm. So it was just getting that balance took us some time, and we, made sure that with our ever long-suffering friends and family, we show these things to them first to see what their reactions will be so that we can get it as right as possible.
Just delving a little deeper into that, were the technologies shown in contrast to sort of nature, in contrast to what people perceive as natural?
No. One of the things that we have delved into in various parts of this is what does natural actually mean? Mm-hmm. And that's been a really interesting one. So for this particular study, we tell people that we're travelling into the future, to imagine that they're already 20 years into the future. The only bias we tend to give is to say that all the technologies that we're about to talk about have passed health and safety, so there's no known danger. And other than that, we're just being in the future.
Okay, interesting. And Amy, how were attitudes and perceptions gauged? Was it mostly around degrees of acceptance?
Yeah, so this is an excellent question because I think it also helps highlight why our research aim is quite important. So if you typically look at acceptance, which is quite often something that is done in quantitative work, because sometimes it's a yes or no answer, you're answering something that is more kind of in the contemporary time of right now, versus if we want to be future looking,
exactly,
you want to the consumer be imaginative and think 20 years into the future, you're going to start looking at different degrees of engagement. So for example, how could they imagine using the technology, or not the technologies, but the products made from the technologies in their daily lives? You can look at the adoption process of is there certain types of consumers that might engage with them through different motivations. So some of them, it may be a convenience factor versus for other consumers, it might be based on nutrition versus others, it may be ethics. So the beautiful thing about, again, that the imaginative work that we do, and also because our work is very field oriented, we're going out and we're talking to people, is you can actually reach those types of nuances. Versus if you were only going to look at, on a scale of 1 to 7, how likely are you to accept this technology? It's actually quite difficult for someone to answer that, not knowing a lot about the technology or exploring it. So I would say acceptance is important. It's almost table stakes. It's almost a thing that you definitely will ask, but you want to go beyond that. Yeah.
Can I just quickly ask, because it is future urban consumer and you've asked these people to imagine themselves in the future, was there any guidance of how to imagine this future world given to the consumers?
One of the things that we found quite helpful is actually if some of the participants do have children, whether those children are little or, into the teenage years, a bit older, if you give them a bit of a hook of how can you, think of your children and how you may, in 20 years, as they're growing up and interacting with these technologies, given that quite often children are so quick to adopt a technology because they're kind of digital natives now, it's quite easy for them to picture their lives in 20 years because you're giving them a bit of an anchor versus if you were to just say, okay, here's a technology, here's a fruit or vegetable or some sort of fermentation, a product that has come out of it. Please think of 20 years in the future. They have nothing to inscribe the scenario in their head. So if you can give them a scenario, that just the children one is one example, and it's quite helpful.
Yeah, I think the other technology that we do tend to use are mobile phones. So most people have had mobile phones for quite some time now. So we say, imagine your mobile phone you had 20 years ago and the functions that it had compared to now. So you've still got the technology, you're still using the technology, but it's a very different technology. It's a very different technology now than it was 20 years ago.
Yes, that's right. And last question about setting the scene of the future. Was there any scene setting around extreme weather events and climate change?
Yeah, so we're doing this research when Australia had gone through some quite extreme weather and then New Zealand was going through some quite extreme weather as well. And so, those are natural biases and people do bring them up and we do reflect on them and on the change, because when we started, people would look out of the window in New Zealand and go, but we live on a farm. Why would we need closed environments? That's crazy. And then the weather events were suddenly like, oh, yeah, that's why we need it. So, yeah, completely understand.
Great, excellent. Well, let's dig into the findings of the study. Amy, were there any common themes in acceptance of specific technologies across the full cohort?
Yeah, so fantastic question. And to be honest, the findings are so complex that we've thought it would be great if we could bring just a couple of key themes in today to really lay the land. But in terms of we'll say broad acceptance of the technologies. So what I'm going to talk about now are more pertaining to our focus groups. So that was where we talked to people one-on-one. It was rich descriptions, qualitative data. So we can't generalize the findings across full cohorts of consumers, but definitely it gives us a really rich insight. One of the key themes that came up was the participants' ability to think of the technologies as problem solvers in their daily lives. So when we introduced, whether it was, GE or whether it was the controlled environments or robotics, participants are quite good at thinking about what can this solve in my life? And we saw very different reactions across our markets. So to give you kind of a nice general insight, within Australia and our New Zealand cohorts, again, Denise mentioned that there had been some weather events, but also there's been quite a focus on climate change in general in the past few years, also by our government, and thinking about how can we potentially solve the issue of climate change in the future. And our participants were very optimistic that if they could solve the problem of, for example, having year-round seasonality from certain fruits and veg, so if something could be farmed indoors and they could have access to it all year and it was local, it would be better for the environment, but also it would protect their food supply from these extreme weather events. So in that way, they were very excited about it. If we go to different markets, so I'll talk a bit about Vietnam. They were also very excited about the technologies, but in a way, the technologies solved almost issues of trust and food safety within their country. So a lot of our participants from Vietnam mentioned that they were actually very aware that their fruits and veg are heavily sprayed with pesticides. And when they looked at technologies such as GE, they thought it could be quite an opportunity to actually have, fruits and veg that might be, less sprayed and be resistant to pests in that way. And they really showed actually an in-depth understanding of that. And they were very excited that this could solve some of the issues they had around health and then also food safety. If we look at a different market that Ivy attended, so Singapore, one problem to solve there was issues around food security. So if we think about the potential to grow food domestically in controlled environments, and again, secure, the future of their food for 20 years without constantly having to look at importing food, that was quite a benefit for the consumers. So the overall key theme of looking to solve these kind of broad societal issues through the use of a technology was something that was quite interesting and also inspiring to us to see people looking for this.
So would it be correct to say then that there was a high correlation with acceptance when there is a concern over food security and food safety in a culture?
That's a fantastic question. We can't necessarily say there's a correlation until we can when we get our quantitative data back. We can definitely come back and tell you that, for instance, if someone has a high environmental value, there will be a high correlation to accept or engage with the technology. Mm-hmm. So in saying that, what we can say is that the general consensus when you do talk to people is that if there's an imperative, so if there's a need for something, it will most likely be more accepted, or there will be kind of less cognitive dissonance around reasons why they don't want to, purchase the product or accept it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Understood.
So you can say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So almost in many of our focus groups, you do need to listen to them, how they justify why this is needed for whatever reason, like from the societal needs or your personal needs, etc. So definitely a reason why, and how the technology can speak to that why, and how they feel comfortable, okay, this is the right solution for solving that problem is really key.
I see. Denise, did the study explore common catalysts that can change attitudes and perceptions?
I think Amy's really been touching on this just in the last questions, and it really is often about situational need and situational factors. If consumers see the benefit outweighing potential risk, then they are much more likely to accept. And so with a technology, it's just the same. If you can cast your minds back, if you're old enough, to mobile phones, when the technology first came into our world, people were quite nervous about it. And would it be giving us cancer? And, would the towers be radiating all kinds of nastiness? And now the vast majority of people would not be without one. So as the benefits became more obvious, they started to outweigh the risk. And that's really what we've been seeing in different situations, as Amy said. So if there's food insecurity, that's a completely different scenario than if you've got a very secure food chain like we do in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. And building on that a little bit, Denise mentioning different types of people in different areas, it's also important to look at, the culture in which people live. So we did notice a bit of a difference between those living in urban centers and those in rural centers. Some of our participants in urban centers were a bit more disconnected from the cycle of food because they're more used to going to the grocery store, buying something that's potentially in a package, and not necessarily, maybe not putting a lot of thought into where did that come from in the first place. So some of these participants had either a completely romantic idea about what farming was like and that it was, the sun and the soil and that was potentially more natural. But we also had some of the urban consumers thinking that actually, we should fully embrace technology and that kind of they were so disconnected from the thought of sun and soil that they thought, well, it's totally fine if we can grow something inside with, artificial lights. That was fine for them. So you get nuances in that area as well. And when it comes to the urban areas, definitely a bit more of a connection to farming, especially here in New Zealand, in that a concern was that what would happen to the jobs. So when we think about potentially bringing in large scale, whether it's vertical farming or potentially robotics and automation, they wanted some sort of reassurance that either farmers could get retrained or at least use their land in a certain way that they still had some sort of livelihood. So there's a little bit of protectionism and that you can understand that growing up in a rural area. So quite interesting looking at the culture that someone is brought up in and where they live and how that would impact their engagement with these technologies as well.
Mm-hmm. Were these people living in rural areas, or were they people that lived and worked on a farm themselves? Because I imagine farmers use a lot of technology to aid their work. And
yeah, fantastic question. And so we wanted to ensure that we had again a sample that was representative of the population, but not necessarily biased. So we did have a few participants that were very involved in the farming community, but we also didn't want to have too large of a cohort that were experts, because then sometimes what can happen is a lot of the other participants feel as though they can't say anything because they have an expert in the room. So we definitely did have some fantastic viewpoints from people that either worked on farms or knew a lot about farming technologies. And it's interesting because there's definitely also a degree of familiarity with these types of technologies. So things like robotics and automation, a lot of participants said, even participants that weren't direct into farming said, oh, we're already using robotics and automation at my work, or we think that this is probably happening already in our food system, versus potentially something like vertical farming. Again, I'm speaking more about New Zealand right now. Vertical farming may be a bit more alien, but if you go across to maybe Singapore, or if we were to chat with some European consumers, specifically, let's say from Holland or some from the Middle East, vertical farming might be actually a bit more familiar. So again, it's these nuances that you find hidden between different cultures.
And do you think the urban population in New Zealand would want to see more vertical farming in urban centres? Was that discussed?
There was definitely an excitement to think about, I'm going to go a bit broad now, but to think about food as a system rather than these kind of isolated units in a supply chain. So definitely urban participants and even some of our rural participants got very excited about the fact that they could have more of a circular system of food.
Yes.
Where they would be able to, look over to the next block and see a building that was growing the lettuce that they were going to eat that day. And they would feel much better about its more local, smaller footprint. So thinking about food as a total system that they wanted to be involved in is definitely, I think, something that scientists should consider in the future, and how we can actually collaborate with consumers rather than just thinking about them as dollars and, someone who's going to walk into the grocery store to buy the product. Thinking about how we can co-create a little bit.
Yeah, change the farm gate to be the entrance to a vertical farm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I think growing locally and supporting local businesses is really a major theme that's been, reoccurring across the New Zealand cohort quite a lot, and that, people want to know about how their food's been produced and who's producing that and how, and then whether they have a chance to engage with them, and technologies can help in that way as well. And that's one of the benefits that they can see from adopting new technologies.
Excellent. You mentioned, Denise, at the start that there was, this balance between benefits and risks. Did that change with each of the technologies considered?
Yes for some and no in general. People either are quite pro-technology or not. And sometimes people talk themselves out of things as well, which is why focus groups are so powerful. I think seasonality is a really good example of that. So people start often by getting quite excited about the idea of being able to have mangoes all year round, say in Australia. and that would flatten the price and availability would just be guaranteed and they'd all be perfect. And then they start to go, oh, but I actually equate them with Christmas. And if I can get them all year round, then they won't be special anymore. And, so, and that was repeated time and time again as well. So, you know, when people are talking about risks and benefits, it can take, that's why rather than a survey where you just have to say yes or no, actually having a conversation where people start talking and then somebody else says something and they finish in a very different place from where they started.
That's amazing. The importance of broad discussions as a population is going to be essential for us moving forward as a country. Were there any other common themes that we haven't covered?
The one thing that's interesting, and again, I want to really highlight, I think, the importance of teams like ours collaborating with scientists into the future, in that consumers now, when we think of a consumer in 2023 versus, 1980, there seems to be a bit of a trend of consumer empowerment that is quite powerful these days. So you see consumers wanting to have a bit more of a voice in many new issues. So you see this across politics, you see this with social justice and a lot of the kind of the brands that you consume now. So there was definitely a very much enthusiastic kind of a generalization for participants to say, we are really interested in understanding who is going to be regulating and controlling these types of technologies, and how can we have a voice in how they're potentially developed. So, of course, we don't have an answer of what that looks like, but I think as we move forward and think of developing these technologies in New Zealand, it will be important to understand how can we bring the needs and wants of consumers into that development. So whether that's recommendations, by social scientists like ourselves, whether that's, at some very high level attempting to inform policy, I think it would be really important to take that desire for control from the consumers and at least consider it. So there is a lot of conversation around, they would love to have not necessarily a referendum, but a say in where these would be located in New Zealand, whether it be urban or rural, whether it was, a very one dominant company that kind of controlled these technologies. They were very interested in topics like that. And that was quite interesting to see.
Interesting.
Across all the groups, we also found that, the sense of control, as Amy just mentioned, is really another quite common theme as well, that I think as human beings, we really love to have the sense of control that make us feel like, secure, that we are in control of the external environments, etc. So we feel like, okay, that's, the life that we are living and things are in order. And that's a really big need for human beings. So we hear people talk lots about, whether the technology is great, but whether we have the enough control and the good control of it, from the point of view like whether the regulatory scheme is in place, whether enough scientific research has been done properly to prove that, whether all these regulations in place, and also like as people not really understand that much of the technical details of the technologies, they actually have more concern about whether these technologies will be used in a proper way, whether that's under control as well, and also like whether we can also keep the social impact of technologies under control, like what are the impacts on the farming communities, whether the small growers will be disadvantaged from adopting new technologies, and also like whether their adoption of the technology means lots of job losses, or whether it's actually a good opportunity to create new jobs, that kind of thing, etc. So really the sense of control also bring all sorts of that kind of thinking into the game as well.
Yeah. So great considerations for Plant and Food to consider in terms of being able to assure the future consumer of that safety and regulation and equity. They've been considered and planned for as much as possible. Just to delve into us as New Zealanders, did the New Zealand cohort differ in any significant ways?
We found that the New Zealand cohort in many ways are quite similar to the Australian cohort, but definitely, as we mentioned before, very different from consumers who are from other countries like Singapore and Vietnam. Like compared to Singapore, they have a very strong government, and then the endorsement from the government is really critical for technologies to obtain the social and cultural license in Singapore. Versus in New Zealand, it's quite impressive to me that although New Zealanders in general quite trust in the government in terms of making sure that the food is safe here, but many consumers brought up that whether the use of the technology will be, as said before, under good control, and whether the technology is being used for its stated intention rather than just making money, whether the technology will be misused, also like, from the ethical point of view, that kind of thing. So that's very interesting that they actually reflect quite a lot on the purpose and the benefits that the technology really will bring to us, rather than just, it's a good technology and we should have it.
I'll dovetail on the back of that a little bit. So there was one other thing that was quite distinct with our New Zealand cohort, in that we have been living without genetic editing for quite a long time, versus some of the other countries that we had focus groups in were much more maybe aware, or they've already been consuming products in that way. So I would say that we had not necessarily some sort of divisive split in any way, but New Zealanders were genuinely interested in learning more about genetic editing. Quite often when we would put up our concept slide, and again, it was very unbiased. It was simply, how does it work in comparison also to genetic modification? And a lot of folks were genuinely interested in learning the difference between the two, because they didn't know there was a difference between GE and GM. And so there was not some sort of strong negative reaction. It was actually, oh, wow, I'm keen to learn more about this. And can you tell me the benefits? Because one thing with New Zealanders that came up both in rural and urban groups was they really disliked the use of pesticides. And it was both on imported products, but also on products that were grown domestically. There was a big concern around health and pesticides. And that could just be a general association that's been created in media. We don't have necessarily anything to back that up. Our team's not saying pesticides are wrong in any way. Again, we're looking at the perceptions of the cohort and the participants. And when they learned, and where they talked it through and they said, genetic editing, you could potentially include a trait in which it was pest resistant, and they saw a lot of positives in it. So I think that it's really an interesting opportunity for Plant and Food to actually look at this and say, the general New Zealander might actually be very interested in learning about this. And that was definitely distinct in our cohort.
It really was. I think curiosity was what we really found, along with people pleading genuine ignorance and being a bit embarrassed because we've just not had the conversation in New Zealand for, 20 years or so. That was the one they struggled the most in getting involved with, because they just didn't have anything to base it on.
I'm thrilled to hear that. I'm thrilled to hear that, as based on the New Zealand cohort, it's a curious bunch and willing to accept where they don't have, or where they have knowledge gaps. So that's fantastic, and definitely what we'll need for our future. So Denise, did the study findings help us understand trends in acceptance over time? For instance, comparing from 20 years ago to 20, 40 years in the future?
Yes, and that's the nature of this kind of work. So, as I say, you pick a market and look in that market, but all things change over time. If you think about something completely different, like how best to raise a child, we do this very differently now than we did even 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. So markets change in the same way. So for our work, we do both backcasting. So we look at what was happening 20 years ago and why things that were great trends fell away and what trends actually continued. And then we do future casting, where we look at what is going on now, what are likely trends, and what are likely to fade away and what are likely to take hold. And there are some very common ones, like we've got an ageing population along with many other countries. But we're a lot more interested now in health span than we are in lifespan. People wanting to make the most of their years, not I want to live to 100, whatever, and those last 10 years are going to be miserable. We'd rather not do that. So we're looking at things like the pandemic brought to people's minds immunity, but whether that will stay as a trend or whether that will fade as the pandemic fades as well. So it is really important to do both backcasting and future casting to be able to get a good idea of what's most likely to go on.
Excellent. Did it come through in any way that people might be shy about new technologies because of the pandemic?
No, I think the opposite, actually. I think that many people saw, the pandemic was just awful. We were relatively protected in New Zealand from what was going on, say, in Europe, and we got the vaccine before too many people were really, really negatively impacted in New Zealand. So I think the fact that we had that technology, which many people, I know not all, but many people see as saving the day, as it were, actually has meant that technology isn't considered as the big bad wolf. It's actually seen as a positive.
Yeah. And even you get a general sense that the everyday person realized how sensitive our supply and distribution systems are during a time of crisis. So you saw that in the pandemic based on obviously something that was a kind of a viral situation, but then you also see it with climate change and severe weather events. So when Denise was talking at the beginning about environmental disruptions and certain things that kind of shake us and break the orthodoxy of what's happening in our daily lives, it really becomes a catalyst for people to step back and say, oh, wow, I could potentially really, think about this technology in a different way because of the need for it. So yeah, it was definitely the opposite of what we saw.
Yeah, we heard participants openly saying we love technologies.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, let's switch gears now and look to the future. Well, we have been looking to the future, but in a different way. Amy, what happens next with the research? How might these findings be used to shape the future of food?
Yeah, so as Ivy mentioned in the beginning, how we typically work in phases of our research is we start more exploratory and we do qualitative work to really understand what are the factors of importance that we find through the research, and then we bring this through to generalize the findings. So we do quantitative work. So right now we're running a very large-scale survey, and we're also running some experiments. We're doing that in 8 countries. So we have over 14,000 participants in total.
Wow.
So it's very large scale. So we're in Singapore, Vietnam, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, United Arab Emirates, and Korea. So we have a very interesting rationale for why we selected each country, which I won't get into today, but happy to chat more about that later. And really the motivation or the research aim for us is, as we came out of the focus groups, we really got the sense that there are certain personal motivations that individuals would have in regards to each technology. So for example, if you look at the potential of, cellular agriculture, some folks would say that is extremely ethical because you won't necessarily need to, slaughter a fish. Versus other participants would look at, for example, genetic editing to say, oh, it's actually healthier for me because we may not need pesticides. So we could create something pest resistance. So for us, the importance of actually being able to quantitatively tease out what are the factors of importance for each technology is going to be really important for PFR in general in the future, because then we can think about framing the technologies in a certain way that actually highlights what consumers want. So rather than just assuming that all the technologies are fantastic because, they're more environmental, you can actually look at a specific factor. So again, I won't go into what the factors are, but maybe we could come back again and chat about the findings for the survey and the experiment. But they really had to do around environmental, ethical factors. There was also local in there and novelty as well. So we have about 8 factors we're looking at, and we'll be able to actually look at causality. So when you present a specific technology, again with a certain framing, we'll be able to look at how likely people are to adopt them and engage with them. Yeah. So that's our next point of call for research.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So lastly, Denise, how will these findings influence the Horticulture Goes Urban research direction here at Plant and Food?
So we consider ourselves to be a platform program. So what we do cuts across what everyone else is doing for them to be able to potentially build on some of the findings. So I think this is what Amy was just saying about the various things that we found, whether it's ethical or sustainability. Those nuanced understandings should help others when they're doing their positioning. So if people are quite concerned about the sustainability angle of growing things indoors, growing environments, not necessarily the growing medium, but the lights, for example. So it's actually understanding these benefits and risks again. And the same for growing plants indoors. As I say, woody perennials indoors are a lot more tricky than leafy greens. So is that going to necessitate genetic editing of some kind? And how do people feel about that? And how do we position it? So those kinds of things. And the other themes that we've not really talked about because we've not had time, but things like, what do people think about being natural? And how might that impact whether they're willing to buy produce from closed environment? So I think in those ways we see ourselves as being kind of the platform that others can actually gain understanding from and then build their own programs.
Excellent. Wonderful. Well, it has been a true pleasure speaking with you all today. Thank you for taking the time to share your research and thoughts about the future of food production and the importance of understanding consumer attitudes and perceptions.
Thank you.
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Yeah.
And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to know more about the topics covered on Sigest, check out the episode pages on the Plant and Food Research website. Please also feel free to subscribe to the Sigest channel and rate and review each episode. Why not give it 5 stars? Thank you and mā te wā.